Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on equity in education with Australia India Institute and Asia Education Foundation. My name is Muskan Jain, and I work as a research associate with Australia India Institute. This institute is a premier Australian center dedicated to the study of India and its bilateral relationship with Australia. It fosters research collaboration and people-to-people linkages, especially in the sectors of education, health, infrastructure, and governance. Asia Education Foundation, on the other hand, equips educators and students with the intercultural learning and global perspectives to navigate a shared future with Asia. We are therefore delighted to partner and bring to you this series of webinar on equity in education. The first one was conducted last year, where we discussed on technology, followed by gender. And we conclude this series today by discussing the well-being component. And before I begin, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all my colleagues and friends who have joined from Australia. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways upon which we work and live, and all the First people working with us across Australia. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and future. So coming back to the topic of today, that is well-being. So the research shows that there's an indisputable link between well-being and the social, emotional, and academic development of students, as well as the educators. However, what we've seen is quite often well-being is somehow considered to be supplementary to the core academic function of the student education. And therefore, practicing inclusive leadership and at the same time a multidisciplinary approach is required. And for that, today we bring to you a great panel with exceptional representatives from the education industry working across India and Australia. And for that, before we begin, just some housekeeping rules. This webinar will be recorded and later will be published across social media. And it's a 60-minute panel discussion, which will be moderated by my colleague, Jennifer Starr. And also, we would love to hear from you and request you to participate and drop in the questions from the option at the bottom of your screens. And I would like to now turn to my colleague, Jennifer. She's the Manager, International Education Partnerships at Asia Education Foundation. Jennifer is Australian qualified teacher and has been working in the Indian education space since 2008. She is dedicated to building the Australia-Asia relationship and facilitating cross-cultural collaboration in education. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Muskan. I'm delighted to be here today to moderate such an experienced panel on such a timely and relevant theme. I'm based in Brisbane, and so I would like to pause to acknowledge that I am living and working on the lands of the Yugara and Turrbal people, and I pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As both Delhi in India and Melbourne in Australia are emerging from yet another COVID-19 lockdown and begin to contemplate a return to face-to-face teaching and what the implications of this are for students, teachers, and the wider community, a discussion about welfare in education is both timely and very important. Although well-being has traditionally been seen as supplementary to the core academic function of school education, research has long shown that there is an indisputable link between well-being and the social, emotional, and academic development of both students and educators. As such, it is a key component of equity within schools, both in India and Australia. As the most recent Melbourne lockdown has shown us, the pandemic is still not contained, and school students in India and Australia continue to experience disruption and uncertainty in their schooling. Experts, such as those we have with us today, warn that a narrow focus on academic achievement and an emphasis on catching up on lost learning could be detrimental to students and teachers' ability to return successfully to the classroom. Focus has thus turned to the role wellbeing plays in the social, emotional, and academic development of students and their teachers and educators. Schools and school systems who have invested in wellbeing prior to the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic are at a distinct advantage as face-to-face education recommences. In our panel discussion today, we'll be looking at wellbeing as a key component of equity in education from an Australian and Indian perspective. We have a multidisciplinary and incredibly experienced panel with us today. And
Yes.
I'd like to note that unlike most webinars, our panel is completely made up of women. Our panel has researchers, policy experts, school leaders and teachers, and those from the NGO sector. The first panelist I'd like to introduce is Dr. Anna Dabrowski, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Australian Council for Educational Research. She works in the Education and Development team at ACER and is an adjunct lecturer at the University of Melbourne. Anna has extensive experience in conducting research in the Americas, Europe and Asia, and coordinating capacity building and professional development activities for researchers and school leaders and teachers. Anna works in the areas of teacher education, school wellbeing and student trauma, and is currently focusing on the impacts of COVID-19 for education systems in the Asia Pacific region. Anna holds qualifications in the areas of education, linguistics and psychology. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for having me, and thanks to everyone who's attending here today.
Our second panelist that I'd like to introduce today is Vibha Khosla, the principal of Sri Ram Global School, Delhi West. Vibha has had a career in education that spans more than 20 years. Her specialisation includes training of teachers, coordinators and school heads so as to help spread the academic dynamism and ingrain passion for innovative teaching in them. She's a certified CBSE resource person for imparting training. Her outstanding experience in dealing with children, parents, and her staff with ease has made a dent in the education industry by actively introducing contemporary ways of teaching, learning, management, and student development. Her belief in the happiness curriculum enhances the positive work environment in which she works. Welcome, Vibha.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Grateful.
The next panelist I'd like to introduce is Jenny Cook, who is the Deputy Principal at Mount Barker High School in South Australia. Jenny has been a teacher with the Australian Department for Education for nearly 30 years. Most of her career has been spent working in disadvantaged schools. She's committed to providing access to education for all and has been implementational in establishing successful programs for disenfranchised young people. Her current role is Deputy Principal at Mount Barker High School, an inter-regional co-educational school in the Adelaide Hills. The main foci of her role are student services, wellbeing, inclusion, and student voice. Previously Assistant Principal for Positive Education and Teaching Practice at the school, she has led the implementation of positive education at Mount Barker High School for the past 8 years and runs regular professional learning for other schools interested in embedding positive education into their practice. Jenny has a degree in education, a graduate certificate in inclusive education, a graduate diploma in art history, and is currently working towards a doctorate with a focus on teachers' experiences with positive education. Welcome, Jenny. I'm impressed that you've managed to fit us in with all that incredible work you're doing.
Thank you.
I'd next like to introduce Raminder Kaur Mak, who is the Dean of International Affairs at Choti Ram School Indore. In Raminder's role, she looks after the school's global citizenship program and teaches English to grade 11 and 12 students. She was recently conferred with the Inspirational Teacher Award of School Enterprise Challenge from the UK-based charity Teacher Man to Fish. The CBSE Teacher Award, a British Council Global Teacher Accreditation Award with Commendation, a British Council Aptus Action Research Mentoring Scheme Award and was a runner-up in the Global T4 SDG Challenge. She ran a community-driven campaign to end silence around mental health, which helped her win the national level Jagra Josh Education Award in 2021 for Best Initiative in the field of mental health. She was the regional winner of a dedicated 2021 Dedicated Teachers Award organised by Cambridge University Press, and she is a British Council School Ambassador, Teach SDGs Ambassador, and is on the advisory panel for the School Enterprise Challenge. Welcome, Raminda.
Thank you so much for having me.
The next panelist I'd like to introduce is Karen Matthias, from the Melbourne Graduate School of Population and Health. Karen Matthias is a public health physician and researcher with interests which span youth and community mental health, participation, inclusion, gender, and equity in community health systems. Karen's research around youth wellbeing has focused on the Nay Disha Youth Resilience Intervention, which she helped to develop with team members in North India, and which has demonstrated improved mental health, resilience, and social inclusion for young people in disadvantaged settings, and has been scaled by the Ministry of Social Empowerment with the National Institutes of Disability. Karen's focus on youth and equity also covers literacy, with a recent paper she has co-authored, The Inconvenient Truth of Illiteracy Inequality, the intersectionality and compounding effects of socio-demographic disadvantage. Recently accepted by India's Economic and Political Weekly, Karen is the founder director of Burans and is a senior lecturer at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. She uses mixed methods in her research. Welcome, Karen. Thank you for being here.
Namaste sabko. Hi everyone, thank you.
And the final panelist I'd like to introduce today is Sonal Kapoor, who is the founder director of Protsahan India Foundation. Protsahan is an organisation that works to support young girls from difficult backgrounds reach their full potential with access to education, healthcare, and gender justice. An Ashoka India Fellow with an extensive portfolio of work at the intersectionality of bringing child protection and healing of childhood trauma together, Sonal has worked passionately in this space for over a decade. Welcome, Sonal.
I look forward to just being here today. Thank you.
So the way this is going to work is we have a number of questions for our panelists, which have been submitted earlier, and I will be asking each panelist one question and then moving on to the next. If the audience has more questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat or enter them into the website so that we can ask our panelists at a later date. So my first question today is for Anna. And looking at wellbeing and wellbeing initiatives in education, there tends to be a focus on students and student wellbeing. So my question today, Anna, is why does teacher wellbeing matter? And what's the link between teacher wellbeing and student outcomes?
Thanks so much, Jen. Teacher wellbeing and teacher mental health is really an area that still continues to be overlooked in research and in practice. This is quite normal for any of us who've worked in schools. We want to put students first. Sometimes this is at the expense of our own wellbeing and our own health over time. There is very little research around what's happening in terms of longer term impacts of teacher wellbeing. However, we do know that particularly during the pandemic, more than 50% of educators, teachers are experiencing mental distress. And this is in the spectrum of feeling overwhelmed through to experiencing complete trauma and PTSD. It's not something that we look at regularly or readily because it's not an easy one to fix. But of course, it's really important that we do look at teacher wellbeing and the impact that it has on student wellbeing. Because if we have a population or a group of people working with kids who can't handle their own stress and aren't being acknowledged for the stress that they face, there's going to be something called vicarious trauma that occurs, and that can impact on students and the way that teachers work with students as well. What we saw before the pandemic is that many teachers already met the criteria for anxiety and depression, unfortunately, simply because of the nature of schools. They can be very reactive environments. Having been a teacher and worked with teachers since, it can be very stressful environments where there isn't a lot of recognition or acknowledgement for the stress that you're facing. So over time, left untreated, that starts to have a significant impact on your mental health. And then of course you start to minimize problems that occur with colleagues or with students as well. So it's really important that we actually do support and acknowledge teachers in terms of their mental health and well-being, because if we don't, not through any fault of their own, but simply because it's logical, when you are burnt out, overwhelmed and stressed, you start to lose a little bit of that empathy and ability to recognize what's going on with students. Some of my co-panelists will talk about this, I'm sure, at the student level, but certainly we want to look at wellbeing as a whole school responsibility and initiative. Teachers are incredibly important as our school leaders, and it's certainly time that we start to acknowledge their stresses as much as students as well.
Thanks, Anna. You've brought up some really interesting and really integral points, I think, in taking a whole school approach rather than an individual approach in focusing on teachers. And we'll come back to that in the second question about how we can actually look at this. But now I'm going to throw another question open to Vibha and the focus on students. So Vibha, despite its importance, student wellbeing is often seen as an extracurricular concern. I know that your school integrates the happiness curriculum to try and integrate this into the formal curriculum. Can you just tell us a little bit about how this works?
Okay. Yes, I would definitely agree that in our country specifically, happiness has never been taken as something which is required. And that's one reason that we've been on a very low level when we come to the happiness index. But it's not the same now. All the government schools or the private schools, they're actually going ahead and introspecting that there is something which is amiss in the curriculum. The curriculum is not holistic unless and until happiness is included in it. So, to start with, there has been a curriculum that has been devised, and that curriculum is going ahead and is being implemented. So, instead of telling people, what to do, how to do, that's what has started to happen in our country. And we're really, really working hard on this. And as far I am concerned, I actually strongly believe that happiness is of utmost importance when we're dealing with children. Even research has proved the fact that students, they learn better if they are happy. And the impact of happiness is directly proportional to the class performance. So the only purpose and the meaning of life and the whole aim and end to human existence is happiness. And how does happiness come? Happiness comes from, when we start getting it from our own self, when we are self-driven from happiness. It's not supposed to be from an outside force. It has to be intrinsic, not extrinsic. So the purpose of education has actually changed, and it cannot be isolated from the needs of the society. And in today's time, it's very, very important. So it's not only educators in India, but I think across the globe are realizing the need for this wellness lessons for the school children, because that's the time that they would learn, they will form their strong value system. And it has been observed that, these students who are more self-aware, who are sensitive, and who are emotionally mature, these children are far more successful in life because they have more abilities to manage their emotions, to manage their relationships with their family and their friends. So hence, happiness has to come in. And there are three types of happiness which are there. So one happiness is the momentary happiness that we call the pleasure. So it's coming through our five senses when we are playing a game, when we're listening to music, when we're eating something good, smelling something good, so that's momentary happiness. We do try, we're trying to include this, but this is short-lived. The deeper happiness that comes from love, that comes from care, that comes from affection, that comes from security. So it's very important that the bonds in the society, in the family, in the school, the rapport with the teacher, this is strengthened. So that's where children start deriving this deeper happiness. And once this deeper happiness comes, it's again important to come to the third level, and that is the, the ultimate level, I would say, and that is sustainable happiness. So how do we get sustainable happiness? So if a child is intrinsically driven to learn, and learning becomes a purpose, and learning is done in a way which is joyful, which is with games, which is active learning, there are reflective conversations. So that's a holistic package that schools have to start giving. So that's how this curriculum is trying to be integrated with the normal curriculum to give a holistic approach for the development of children. Because once children are happy, they will be more balanced, they will be more resilient, they will have a sense of calmness, they would be more peaceful, and they would find the purpose to life. And if we find the purpose to life, then that is what that's what our aim is for education. So this is what is being actually tried, and we are trying to take good practices across the globe and trying to integrate this in our curriculum at the time being.
Thank you, Vibha. You certainly make a case for happiness or well-being being integrated into the formal curriculum, particularly in light of the pandemic and your school's experience with grounding happiness in the formal curriculum has obviously set it up for your students' resilience through these tough and challenging times. I'm now going to turn to Jenny and Raminda and try and tease a little bit more of this, this comparison, or the perspectives from an Indian and Australian perspective out, and look at how your schools have and what policies and interventions your school has implemented to support the well-being of both your students and your teachers during the pandemic. So Jenny, would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I guess for us, we've been embedding positive education in the school for 9 years now. So it was 8 years last year, and we developed a very solid, explicit positive education course, as well as having it embedded through the school's policies and procedures. So we had quite a focus on wellbeing in the school anyway. But I guess early in April last year, when it looked as if we were going to have to close down schools, and I will say South Australia, we never did lock down schools, so we actually didn't end up there. But we started looking very much at resilience. And I guess we were very conscious of the fact that everyone, staff and students and parents, the whole community, were all suffering from grief and loss, because it was a pretty sort of confronting change last year. And so we actually developed an online program. We developed a website. It was a resilience program with weekly activities that were backed by research that built resilience, that was designed for staff, students and parents to access and work through each week. And we had it designed so that it could be used at home, but in the end it was actually used at school by staff and students in what would have been our regular positive education lesson instead. We also shared that with a number of other schools in South Australia. We also developed, I guess, very clear processes. We were very conscious of the fact that we have a number of highly vulnerable students, and we developed very clear processes and very clear kind of responsibilities in terms of maintaining contact with those students and their families. And for about 5 weeks in South Australia, families had the option of keeping students home if they felt that that was a safer thing to do. And during that period of time, we found that some of these vulnerable students were the ones who were kept home. So we had a process of maintaining contact with the families and maintaining contact with the students, including, we couldn't do it during that period, but later on in the year, what we found was as students were, that option was no longer available and families were meant to have their students back at school. They were the families that we had trouble getting back to school. And so we have a process of regular visits to wellbeing visits as well to maintain that contact with those highly at-risk students. I guess one of the things we did find we needed to do was increase our allocation of time we have one youth worker in the school as well as a wellbeing leader, and we needed to increase our youth worker hours. So we employed another part-time one because they were finding an increase in, I guess, higher level demand for services in the wellbeing team. And we also sort of focused on, with the staff, on kind of thinking, okay, what isn't essential? What can we drop off? What can we just forget about for the time being and focus on what's really important? And so a lot of it was focusing on sharing kind of experiences, sharing new learning, looking at wellbeing for staff. So we were doing the Building Resilience program, but we also were looking at tips for staff to build resilience and finding new ways to share food together, because we couldn't do our usual kind of bring in a plate and share it. So, you know, packets of chips and packets of biscuits and things that we actually, you know, individual serves that we could do. So just trying to find some ways of still being able to share together, but having that consciousness of what staff were going through and being aware of that.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm already seeing some comparisons between your positive ed curriculum and the happiness curriculum, and how this was embedded. The success of your school was essentially embedded, or the success of your school throughout the pandemic was because you had these programs embedded prior to the pandemic occurring. And I'm also, I really appreciate the focus on relationships that your school seems to have, both the student-teacher relationship and the teacher-teacher relationship to maintain well-being. So thank you for sharing those experiences. I wonder if Raminda could please just touch on or perhaps bring a different perspective about what school policies and interventions her school implemented to support well-being of students and teachers during the pandemic.
Thank you for asking me this question. The sudden onslaught of the pandemic, coupled with the lockdown last year, inspired us to explore the mental health related challenges faced by our students and also provided immediate solutions for the same. It also kick-started the much needed discussion around well-being of students and teachers. In our school, we came up with a creative solution to ensure widespread awareness about mental health and de-stressing the young minds by designing a virtual forum, the Amygdala Let the Mind Bloom. Named after the Integrative Center for Emotional Behavior in our brain, the amygdala was developed as a platform that can help adolescents achieve psychological resilience through international webinars, resource packages, and mindful activities. It is a community-driven solution that focuses on long-term impact, empowering action at the local, national, and international levels, and sustainable educational practices. Collaborating with my students, we have organized 4 international webinars for students and teachers of our school, as well as different schools in India and abroad, that is Bangladesh, Nepal, Philippines, Lebanon, Taiwan, Turkey, Egypt, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, USA, and UK during the period August-December 2020. The webinars were conducted by mental health specialists and doctors of the US and India. These webinars assisted the students in learning about coping mechanisms and mindful activities to deal with stress. We organized an online global discussion on believing in yourself is the key to good health for grade 11 and 12 students of our school and schools of Lebanon, Kazakhstan, Vietnam, Republic of Korea, Nepal, and Philippines on the occasion of UN Day on October 24, 2020. This discussion bolstered positivity among students of various schools across the globe and assisted in shattering stereotypes surrounding mental health. At the grassroots level, we organized in-house sessions related to students' well-being for grade 6 to grade 10 students, which were conducted by our school counselors, city councillors, and health officers from the Ministry of Health. These were also attended by teachers teaching these classes who realized the importance of facilitating communication between the students, their parents, and counselors to help identify mental health issues. The teachers started building resilience amongst the students by motivating them to write about positive stories and new skills learned during the pandemic. As a part of the Manodarpan initiative of the Ministry of Human Resources and Development India, we also held poster making, slogan writing activities for the students of class 6 to 8, which helped the students to create awareness on well-being and alleviate stress. Thanks to these activities, our students realized the challenge of mental health and the importance of talking to parents or counselors in case of distress. On similar lines, we organized a session by a doctor for parents of grade 9 to 12 to apprise them about various mental health issues of adolescents and the need to be vigilant at all times. Parents were encouraged to listen to their children's problems, provide emotional support in resolving issues related to anxiety and stress, and consult the counselor if need be. They were asked to act as role models as children would closely observe their behavior and take cues to manage their emotions during these exigent times. Emotional literacy program was started in the school for teachers' socio-economic well-being. Various sessions were taken by the school principal and school counselors dealing with self-care of teachers and to build resilience amongst them in these times. Teachers were encouraged to talk to school counselors in case of distress. They were provided flexibility in taking classes if they had problems. They could reschedule their class to a different timing other than that mentioned in the timetable, and sometimes other teachers of the department took their classes. Training programs were designed for teachers, which were facilitated by experts to support the teachers in teaching students online. When the school switched to the licensed version of Google Suite for teaching remotely, they were guided to use the platform efficaciously along with access to various online tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Raminda. What really jumped out at me there was that even though you did have the kind of a formal training curriculum, really the key to your success was, again, the relationships and connections, which Jenny has spoken about, but also community involvement. So it wasn't just a school element, but it was also parents, teachers, counsellors. And that's a really important aspect for well-being. So just kind of taking up this theme, and I'm now going to turn to Sonal and go beyond the school and really focus on well-being in children outside an education context. A question for Sonal is, navigating the crises of a global pandemic, well-being of the students has become a very important discussion. In your experience of supporting and working for the community, what is the reality on the ground? Also, do socioeconomic factors inhibit equity in education?
Thanks, Jen, and thanks to everyone. I think all the educationists who spoke before me, I think there's so much to learn from each of you. We work in a very, very different context, which is basically where we say that a step before equity in education is just equity, right? Where you're talking about child protection as an issue. In a home where there is no food, education will always be a luxury or beyond. So for example, something as tiny as, for all these years, last 11 years of Protsahan, we've been working with children who've been very, very vulnerable. When we're saying the vulnerability mapping of such children, these are children where sexual exploitation, child labor, child marriages, these are an everyday, battle to fight. So for example, all of these last years rather, one of the access points that we would try and improve was menstruation or best menstrual hygiene practices in adolescent girls from slums, from rural spaces, etc. And something as, in the last 10 years, a little win that had happened was that they had started using more sustainable practices of, using what kinds of sanitary napkins, etc. But now, this year or since last year, the question of even having or even affording an underwear has become a question, right? So leave alone the access to sanitary napkins. So going back in time is what, going back on the goals that we had kind of done, kind of achieved so much progress on, we are falling back on as a country. And not just as India, I think this goes across the board, right, in the developing nations. We have also seen, there's a lot of conversations. In fact, in the last 1 month, I think we joke amongst ourselves internally in the team, that in a year we would have probably a couple of newspapers who would probably cover our work, etc. But in the last 1 month, we have had everybody from a New York Times or a Washington Post to the Straits Times to, who's trying to cover our work on the ground. And the first question that comes us, that's coming up, hey, can you give us a quote about COVID orphans? Can you tell us something about children who are losing parents? And we constantly are, something as, so when you're talking about vulnerability, before education, there is a space of protection and safety, right? I think Vibha spoke about the security and safety. Is that even ensured? Because if that is not, as a core minimal benchmark of what you're doing, education is never going to make sense for a child who's always absent at school. Education will never make sense to a child jiske peet mein khana nahi hai, who's hungry all the time for the want of, just food. So I think, and then of course there's this conversation of digital divide, access to digital devices, which is a whole another set of conversations, right? And then gender, how the phones or the digital devices or smartphones always stay in the hands of the man of the house or the boy of the house and never with the adolescent girl. But even with the journalists, while talking about the conversations where they came up to us that, hey, we want to talk about COVID orphans, we helped them realize that, at the end of the day, it's not just what you feel, which is newsworthy or newspaper worthy information. Yes, children are losing parents. Nobody is denying that. But is that 100% or 80% part of the problem? No. That's probably 6 or 8% part of the problem that we're looking on the ground as a ground reality. The rest, 92% is where children are being pushed into sexual trade or transactional sex by their very own parents because there's no food on the table, right? So for every 3 hours of sex work, a 12-year-old probably brings back a 3 kg rice, 4 kg of flour, etc., right? In a space like that, or in spaces where the mother and father, the parents, are daily wage workers, access to digital devices and websites and sanitary napkins and learning outcomes, these are far-fetched realities for in the populations where we work. The first thing you have to do is make sure, is the child protected? Does the child have that equity, that space? Because there's a lot of difference between equity and equality, and we need to understand that with our work on the ground. So as Protsahan, we our way of work is we work through a model that we call the HEART approach, which is HEART as an acronym, for H standing for healing, because without healing the childhood trauma, everything and anything as a 90%, 95%, 98%, the percentages that now are required to enter colleges, all of that will be a sham because the childhood trauma of the child is not healed. So healing being critical aspect of everything that we do. E for education, A for art-based life skills, because the art is not just drawing on, painting on paper. Art meaning photography, filmmaking, things like mandala art and psychosocial mental health aspect of art, and including that in the everyday aspect for a child who will never otherwise have access to a mental health or a therapist or a art, or because this is luxury, right? HEAR for recovery from trauma, and T for technology, because this child also needs to be mainstreamed or have access, equity and access to all of those things that have been spoken before. So using the HEART approach, focusing on 3 core vertical areas of creativity, everything that we do, we make sure that creativity, intersectionality, and a sense of entrepreneurship is built in the child at the last mile. Because without the core basics being set in place, everything will be inaccessible or a sham for that child.
Thank you, Sonal. That was a very sobering view into the realities of well-being. I think what really stuck with me that was, you said before, equity in education, we need equity. And the work you do is going towards that, to build that equity outside of the education process. Thank you for that. Our next question is for Karen, and I was hoping you could build on what Sonal has said and briefly tell us about the youth resilience interventions you have developed for young people and the mental health and well-being outcomes from these interventions. Are these interventions being used in schools, or could they be adapted to schools?
So thanks very much. We've been running a youth resilience intervention in Uttarakhand, and we started running it initially with young people in busties or informal urban communities. And actually it was young women who had done 8 years schooling or less, so that a lot of them had dropped out of school. The reason why we focused on youth resilience is we know that the impact of childhood adversity, things like gender inequality and disability, increases mental illness, but that if you get psychosocial assets can be taught and strengthened and can moderate the impacts of these adversities. So we've been running these groups for several years. We've done quite a number of like academic evaluations, and it's a group. Typically, we would have a group of 10 to 12 young people. We've been holding the groups in communities, and the modules feel very much on things like Viva was discussing around, Martin Seligman's happiness approaches and youth development, positive mental health. So a number of things that we've already discussed today, and looking at building skills in young women. And these have been going, we've had really great outcomes. And so we've run them, they run over 4 to 5 months, a group meeting every week, very strong relationships building and kind of peer friendships and rehearsal of positive communication, which leads to people doing, then having the skills to communicate at home and decision making. But what we found is that we're getting really, we thought we really need to use the opportunity of running these in schools. And so that was the big plan for 2020, but COVID came along. And actually it turned out we went ahead in that hiatus between the big COVID surge and the unlocking. So from around September last year until around February this year, there was fairly free movement in communities in India. And it was just incredibly positive participation. So we had several hundred, I think it was over 500 young people participating in our program. And because of COVID, it was almost the only formal input going into people's lives. And so we got really great responses. And some of the ways we adapted the program was to use smaller groups. We were using it based in homes, but we totally know it can work well in schools. But also looking at how are you coping with COVID? How are you coping with stress? And young people really kind of mentoring and supporting each other. And when one person was down, working people and doing pairs and mentoring. And really great support from parents. So we're writing this up because we really found it was particularly effective and really high participation from young men who were less good at attendance during non-COVID times. So we're really excited and feel like we'll probably be running it again as soon as things unlock again in India after this current surge in COVID numbers. And young people are terribly enthusiastic, and it's all facilitated with young people who are under the age of 25. So the facilitators get a lot of benefit too. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. It sounds like there's great work being done and huge potential for schools in India in particular. But I just think it's really interesting that a lot of the themes that your program touched on were also touched on in Vibha, Raminda and Jenny's discussions about the happiness curriculum and positive education and their mental health programs that were kind of embedded in the community. So thank you for sharing your experiences with us. We're now going to go for another round around the panelists and really look at, go deeper onto some of the issues that we've been talking about, and just reminding the audience, if you do have questions, pop them in the chat or through our website and we can have a look and see how and see if there's time at the end to ask them. So my next question is then for Anna. Last time you were really talking about teachers, even before the pandemic, were under stress and hugely had huge challenges in their job. So I'm just wondering what the research says about teacher wellbeing in Australia, and has the pandemic in any way changed the way teacher wellbeing is approached, either at a school or at a policy level?
It's really interesting. I think certainly there's more acknowledgement of teacher wellbeing as an issue. Australia has heavily embraced the concept of supporting wellbeing, you know, with students many years ago. Teacher wellbeing sort of still catching up. I think, as Sanal was talking about, we do have a slight problem though in the way that teacher wellbeing is acknowledged. That sort of spectrum in terms of people who may have, you know, some level of disengagement, instead of actually looking at the fact that many teachers are experiencing quite high levels of secondary trauma and vicarious trauma. One of the other problems, of course, in Australia is that we also have a huge equity issue in terms of schools and students and in terms of resourcing and support. So sometimes it's the teachers that need the most help that actually aren't receiving it. And sometimes there are interventions that are actually not evidence-based that are being used within schools that aren't sort of widely supportive. As Sanal was saying before, you know, if you're trying to treat someone with trauma with a sort of a pulse check or a quick technological solution, it's not always going to work. And what we're seeing in Australia, certainly as in the US and the UK, is there is this proliferation of online interventions, applications, heavily sort of based in positive psychology, but trying to treat issues that they can't. So instead of thinking about positive affect and happiness, as we've heard, which, you know, there is an evidence base to suggest that these work, they're trying to treat trauma and stress and acute stress and anxiety and depression, where the evidence base gets a lot less rigorous. The evidence and the research behind some of the interventions used for teacher wellbeing is really far behind the speed with which interventions are being introduced. And I'm sort of a little bit concerned, I guess, in Australia, as Sanal was talking about before, that some of the people that are most vulnerable and really need the most support are not necessarily being supported as well, because there has been a huge focus on learning loss and catch-ups. And I think, as we've seen previously around principal wellbeing, the fact that we know school leaders in particular experience acute amounts of stress, threats to their personal safety, harassed and subject to parent demands. This is going to be something that becomes increasingly common post-pandemic as well, especially as parents panic about the trajectories of their children. And we're going to see again an expectation that teachers help them play catch up. Teachers aren't qualified to diagnose mental health issues, but there's an expectation that we do and that they do. And I think a lot of this again is going to have a huge impact on the stress that teachers were already carrying. So I'm really hopeful that there'll be more conversations and more research. There is absolutely no research looking at teacher trauma in Australia, even though we know from the United States that there is a large proportion of teachers who experience trauma and stress. So when we think about well-being as a big spectrum, if we're sort of thinking about some of those initial conversations about relationships and connections, this is really encouraging. But as Sonal referred earlier, if we don't actually support people who are the most vulnerable, really bad things are going to happen.
Thank you, Anna. Again, and more sobering thoughts that we need to focus on moving forward. Now, we're just in the essence of time. I'm going to jump quickly to Jenny and Raminda and just ask, how has the pandemic changed the way, pulling on the themes that Anna has brought up, how has the pandemic changed the way you and your school think about an approach to student and teacher wellbeing? Remember, we're running short of time, so Jenny, if you could give us a few words about this in your school.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I guess for us, wellbeing has been quite a focus for a number of years now. So in some ways, I would say that really we felt that our focus on wellbeing was affirmed, and it didn't make a lot of change to how we thought about wellbeing. And we'd done a lot of work. We'd done some work with Martin Seligman, work with Geelong Grammar. We'd done a lot of work in training staff up in positive psychology. And had that embedded already throughout all of our policies and practices and in our mainstream curriculum. So I think it was really quite affirming for what we were already doing, and just for us, just showed us how important it was to keep that focus at a time when really the focus from the government is very much on improving literacy and numeracy and not really talking about wellbeing very much at all. We also, I guess one of the things that we've continued to do is working with other schools as well, because we think that's actually really important, is supporting other schools who are looking at how they can embed more positive psychology practices into their schools and supporting that. I'm just having a quick look. And I guess we did notice, one of the changes we did notice at an on-the-ground level was an increased number of what you'd call higher level referrals to our wellbeing team. Now, our wellbeing team, their role is to listen, to refer on to professionals. But what they were finding is that they were dealing with so many of these higher level referrals, and also finding professionals to refer them on was getting harder and harder. Headspace have about a 3-month waiting list. Our Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service has a similar waiting list. So, you know, trying to kind of look after these students, knowing how hard it was to get professional support with them, has become an issue. And the other thing that they found was a lot of the smaller things that they could nip in the bud before they became big things, they weren't having time to get to. So this has been a stress for our wellbeing team.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to jump in and ask Raminda to tell us a little bit about how the pandemic has changed the way their school thinks about and approaches student and teacher wellbeing.
We at our school realize that children's emotional and physical development has not been possible during the pandemic. The learning environment that the students were provided in offline school has not been possible, as the students used to be involved in multifarious activities involving group and peer tasks. Moreover, during the pandemic, the children are living in a restricted atmosphere in their homes where they're not able to meet their friends and relatives. To overcome this, we have maintained regular communication with the parents throughout the session, encouraging them to support their children and spend quality time with them, talk to them of things that they are interested in, and not to be critical about their views. We believe that children need a routine, regularity, and social interaction to manage their mood swings, and a breakdown in these factors can precipitate their well-being. Parental support is needed to provide children with the best learning conditions and support them in their studies during the pandemic. However, it has been observed that all students do not receive the same amount of parental support. In such cases, we believe the role of teachers and counselors is important, as they can guide the students and reach out to them. Teachers also need to acknowledge the emotional issues being faced by children, as everyone these days is undergoing some kind of turmoil. The major objective for teachers is to facilitate learning, and they must adopt a rational and empathetic approach towards children. We believe learning is an emotional phenomenon, and unless we teachers have an emotional connect with the students, learning cannot take place. So the online classes must satisfy the emotional needs of the children, and there must be a free flow of communication between students and teachers. We believe that parents and teachers play a pivotal role in students' well-being. Teachers must understand that parents also have problems and limitations, while parents also must understand that teachers are undergoing the same type of problems. Both parents and teachers must build a support system and work together for the development of children and ensure effective learning to be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raminda. That's really interesting information. I'm now going to throw it over to Vibha and ask if the happiness curriculum it has helped your students. Building on these themes, has the happiness curriculum helped your students deal with the pandemic?
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, it has immensely helped not only the children, the teachers, their families. It's helped me as well. You know, staying indoors in these enclosed houses, it's very difficult how you manage. So if we have something to look forward to, it's giving us a purpose in life. And the strong rapport that has been formed with the children and the teachers, in the peers, in the family. So if one person was affected, the other was there. So, you know, we've actually seen a lot to happen at this point of time, and we've seen that the curriculum that we are following, children are much more engaged because technologically everybody's become on the same platform. We've changed the entire paradigm for teaching and learning. Now it's not just teacher centric or student centric, but the learning here has become learning centric. So the whole environment has become for learning. And this curriculum has given so much of value to children. We are practicing mindfulness, we're practicing spirituality. We are telling children that even the smallest, the youngest ones that we have, the nursery and the KG, kindergarten students, there also we've taught them how to inhale and exhale. I just did a very small activity very quickly. You tell them to inhale and exhale, it may not be. So we tell them blow a candle, smell a flower. These children have started getting mindful of these minute things. We've taught them to be grateful for what they're doing. So with happiness curriculum, it's not only happiness, but mindfulness, resilience, gratitude, and forgiveness. These are all the qualities that have been imbibed by the students. And also would like to share that at this point of time, when we were in the worst of situation and one of the teacher or any family needed help, it was children who were going ahead and helping. They went to the extent of going ahead and getting oxygen cylinder for their teacher and their family. So that's where the rapport, that's where the connect has been formed. And when you do something for somebody, there is compassion. So this feeling of compassion is again leading to happiness. So I've seen so much of change just with this happiness curriculum and the looking forward of children to come for the classes. They're excited. They don't want a break. They want to be with their teacher. They want to enjoy the lessons that they're doing. So that's the change that we've seen, that motivation that we've seen, and we've tried to address all the four pillars of learning with this help of happiness curriculum, that is learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and to learning to live together. So I feel that happiness curriculum has been of immense help, and we need to go ahead and get it forward to everybody. It's not only in a period, but it has to be with every class. All the classes have to be empowered with so many activities, so much of engagement, so much of experiential learning, so much of exploration, that students start looking forward to these. The connects that they have, they become stronger. And I'm sure we will be raising these children, and the country would definitely, the happiness quotient that we have, the happiness index where we are, would definitely will go up the bar. And IQ is definitely important, but EQ is extremely important. So yes, well-being and happiness is important, and to bounce back to it is extremely important, which I've heard from all my esteemed members here, that resilience, that's another quality that I believe in. So with this, I would say, yes, it's been a very lovely and a fruitful experience, and we've seen a lot of positivity through.
Thank you, Vibha. It's very interesting seeing how all the perspectives are kind of aligning, and the approaches of schools that had this embedded in their curriculum as a formal element are approaching the pandemic and coming through the pandemic. And it's heartwarming to know that your students are acting as leaders within the community for these traits. So thank you.
Thank you.
Moving towards, or moving outside schools again, again, keeping mindful of time, a question for Sonal. The National Education Policy of 2020 in India talks about policy changes to promote the well-being of students. Are there any key considerations to promote holistic well-being of students or the girl child that you could recommend?
I'll quickly, I think maybe just make 2-3 quick points. that, every time we are talking about well-being and mental health and the spirituality or the happiness quotient part of the things, I think, there's this silly little meme that I read, and something that's just stuck in my head, that says thoughts and prayers and spirituality, and there's a big cross on it, and then it says policy and change and science and scientific thinking. And I think I would rather make it like, some sort of a balance between the two, rather than saying, I think like Vibha was very rightly saying that EQ is important and IQ is as important. Some days EQ ends up being more important. Yet at the same time, in the political space scenario that we find ourselves in, I think across the world, globally, it's not just an India specific phenomenon. We can't operate in silos as an education system or a school that says, hey, we are doing such good stuff for our children and our teachers. But because the child at the center of this whole paradigm, you can't just look at the child and the family and the school. It has to be the child, the family, the school, the immediate socio-cultural context, and the society, because if you're looking at this child and family and teachers, and that's just about it, you're doing injustice to the child per se. So you have to make sure. In fact, this was one of our, feedback also with the NEP, with the National Education Policy, that, okay, the MPhil has gone, or, vocational part of the understanding for children from class 6 onwards is now being put in place. But if you really, so it probably outlines the, the what's that have to be done, like this is what needs to be done, this is what needs to be done. But the how part of it, how that needs to be achieved, it's still a question. Because when you're going back to the budgetary allocations earlier this year, you still go back and you see, the budget for children has reduced. So we can say whatever we want, in terms of this curriculum and that website and this policy change and, this national education policy. But if the budgetary allocation has been reduced from a 3.14 to a 2.46%, I think who are we trying to fool here, right? Because the budgets from top down have decreased for our children in the country. The second quick point is also that, like I said, the entire socio-political economic context, because we cannot understand equity if we do not understand the challenges that a Bahujan, Adivasi, Dalit child faces, the intersectionalities and the marginalization that child faces. If you're only talking about the, children who already have access to 20 things and are facing mental health issues, that's one part of the pie. The other part of the pie is also where children are facing absolute, questions on rights and dignity. Right. So we have to look at it in a balance. We cannot try and fool ourselves that, hey, let's not teach our children. Civics will still be of 10 or 20 marks in the entire social sciences paper, or political science or civics as it's called here. But when you talk about the history, so the history textbooks are changing. I think there's a lot to question. There's a lot of balance that we need to have. If there's grief, if there's a lot of gratitude that, hey, we have been saved and, we're attending the seminar. There's also a lot of grief and loss that the children and families are facing, irrespective of, I think, the socioeconomic backgrounds. And that grief and loss also has to be tackled. The difficult conversations, the politically incorrect conversations, somebody has to come up and talk about those political incorrect conversations. Otherwise, it's all superficial. It needs to go deep. It needs to touch the rights and the dignity of those, the child, which is who's been left behind. In terms of the national education policy, I think after 34 or 36 years, I think after 1986, we've done some revamp. Parts of it are okay, but I think there's a lot of it that still needs to, be kind of, because states like Kerala and Delhi, they were like, hey, we haven't been consulted enough when this was coming out. So a lot of questions still remain.
Thanks very much, Sonal. Now, given that Karen was so good in her answer last time, she's actually already answered her second question about how you adapt your approach to resilience, or how she adapted her approach during the lockdown, when she told us about how it worked in the school, or the school pilot. So I'm actually going to skip that question and go straight to an audience question that we have from Prema, who has asked, I'm wondering if you can share any measurement or yardstick that Indian schools can employ to measure happiness in students, or do they just do it by observations and surveys? So perhaps Vibha or Raminda would be in a position to answer this for us.
Jennifer, can I?
Please do.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a very nice question which says a yardstick for happiness. So as I said, that research has also said that a child's performance, is directly impacted by the child's well-being. So if a child's performance that we are doing, the assessments that we are doing, if those assessments are not just the pen and paper test, but those assessments are taken as formative assessments, and that's where the teacher is forming a connect with the child. And if a child is not there, the child is not happy, the child is not performing, the child is not showing up the way the child should be. So that's an indicator that there is something which needs to be done, there is something which is amiss. So that's what the yardstick that we use for the time being. We haven't started measuring happiness, if I say on a scale, but a continuous and a comprehensive assessment that we do of the child. That's where we come to know whether the child is happy or the child is not happy. And the child's state of mind, the child's performance, that again, is something that is being taken as a yardstick to measure this happiness. So I hope I'm able to answer this. I mean, if there's something else, please let me know.
Yeah, a very comprehensive answer. Thank you so much, Vibha, and I put you Jennifer with that one.
Thank you.
So this is wrapping up our panel, and I think it's been from my perspective, it's been an excellent event. There have been so many issues and so many perspectives that overlapped. I think for me, the key themes were schools that had happiness or positive education embedded in the curriculum prior to the pandemic, were actually their students were able to stand up and be resilient during the pandemic and actually act as leaders throughout that. Another important aspect that came out was that happiness is or well-being is not something that can happen in a school individually. It's all about community and connection. So for student well-being and teacher well-being and school well-being, the whole community has to be involved. And then, of course, touching on what Anna said, underpinning all this, teachers' well-being is integral because there is a distinct link between teacher well-being and student achievement. And unless we get that right and recognise what our teachers are doing in the classroom, then we can't really start off with our student well-being. So I'd just like to thank all our panellists who have done an amazing job, and a number of them are actually dialing in today from places like Delhi or Melbourne, and so they are actually in lockdown themselves and living what they're talking about. So we appreciate that you took the time to be here and share your expertise with us and share your understanding with us. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague Hamish Curry, who's the Executive Director of the Asia Education Foundation, to close the webinar.
Thank you very much, Jen. And again, to echo my thanks to all of our wonderful panelists again in this great discussion on equity in education. And I suppose that does somewhat bring us to the end of this first series in our work on this theme, because it began with a conversation with our partner, Australia-India Institute, to actually explore what does equity in education look like when we look at often both the quite diverse and somewhat shared perspectives between Australia and India. And over the course of these three webinars, we've explored with a whole range of different researchers, specialists and educators, exactly what does that look like with the role of technology and how it's evolving. We have again heard that perspective today about the digital divide, and it's something that certainly came up in our very first webinar quite strongly. But it was also about the access not just to the hardware, but also to the software. You know, how quickly have all of us adjusted to the world of Zoom now. It has become a verb the same way that, just Google it became a verb. And I think that's the way in which the words that we use and the language that we use, and even in the short space of time that we've been through some of these transitions, it actually has changed how we both interact and see the world. And that has also had an influence in the skills of navigation through technology. Something that when we looked at the stories between Australia and India, there was actually a lot of diversity, but a huge array of shared perspectives on exactly how the pandemic had exposed inequity. And we've heard that again today, where the pandemic, while horribly tragic in so many ways, it actually has exposed things that already we knew were issues and actually made them more pronounced in terms of how urgently we need to address them. In our second webinar in the series, we looked at gender. And no doubt the conversation there again was equally rich. An opportunity to look at how education for girls and boys can create different elements of access. And also, as we've talked about today, how it plays a role in the teaching workforce, given that very often, both between Australia and India, there are often commonalities in how females tend to take up more proportion of the education workforce than males. And it's something, again, we often have to look at what does that mean to the way in which we prioritise teaching and balance and the differences in the working lives that people have. And I think one of the other lenses we brought into the space of gender was also looking how it plays a role in curriculum, how we look at literacy differently in terms of the proportions, particularly of girls and boys who are literate, and particularly the role of areas like STEM and how it's actually challenging the notion of actually what we might assume to be certain gender responsibilities. And I think it's where we've heard about today, things that we can do that disrupt our assumptions about how things should work. And today, of course, on wellbeing, our third and probably our most evident issue at the moment in terms of both what is, I would say, a very easy lockdown in Melbourne. We've done this so many times in Victoria, and particularly feeling for our colleagues in India, where I think the situation obviously is far more serious. And I think this brings us to why, with our partners at the Australia-India Institute, we wanted to create this series around equity in education. And I would sum it up, it's 3 E's. The first was about exposure, hearing about stories, being exposed to different voices and different facts and the nature of how the world is shaping itself around education. The experiences, stories from educators, from researchers, people in policy, people in startups and NGOs, and what do those experiences tell us on the ground about what's happening? And most finally, and I hope again today, you've, as our audience, you've heard this, is about empathy. And empathy at its heart is about the opportunity to listen, observe, and question. And for both our educators and our students, we know that empathy is the kind of skill we want them to develop through their education. And so again, on behalf of the AEF and the Australia-India Institute, I want to again acknowledge the wonderful work by the teams in those two organisations that have come together for this series, and again share our warmest thanks and gratitude to all of our speakers in this series, again to our wonderful panellists today. We'll be releasing again the series of this video as we've mentioned, and you can catch up on the rest or the other episodes in this series. And we do look forward to continuing this conversation about equity in education, as we know it is such an important topic at this point in the world, and how it is evolving and how it's looking to constantly improve the education we give to our societies. So again, thank you. Best wishes to everyone, and we look forward to connecting with you again. Thank you.